Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. On May the 9th, 1950 at 6 p.m., the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. Schuman's vision for Europe was for a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. Those values were also foundational for the European Convention on Human Rights, also drafted in 1950. Now, 2 years before, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had already been ratified in the UN General Assembly of December the 10th, 1948 in New York. Robert Schuman was present, as was Charles Malik. And Charles Malik was actually one of the members of the drafting committee. And we have in the studio tonight with us his son, Habib Malik. And we want to welcome you, Dr. Malik. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and for having this conversation about your father, whose life actually has impinged on all of our lives in the modern world, whether we have ever heard his name or not. And Dr. Malik is a human rights activist. He's also the senior fellow with the Philos Project and the director of the Charles Malik Foundation. And so thank you so much for joining us from Beirut tonight. Our normal format would be with a different different technology, but we've had to resort to plan B, and that is the Zoom. We're going to have a very interesting conversation, I know, because you and I have had a preliminary talk. But I just want to recall the fact that tonight actually is November the 9th. It's the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, 4 decades after the signing of the UDHR, that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I'd like to come back to this event later and ask you, Habib, if you see any connection between the passing of the UDHR and perhaps the whole nest of events around that and the events of 1989 and 1990. But first, who was Charles Malik and how did his life impact our times?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to the Schuman Center. It is an honor for me to be here tonight with you. Charles Malik was a Lebanese philosopher and statesman and an international diplomat. And he actually started out his education up to the bachelor's degree in the hard sciences, in mathematics and physics. And then he later taught mathematics for 4 years at the university. And then he had a lifelong passion for philosophy and decided to try and go and study under Alfred North Whitehead, who himself, of course, came from a background of science to philosophy, and he was at Harvard. And
one of the world's leading philosophers at the time. Yeah,
that's right. And so Charles, the young Charles, wrote out of the blue to Whitehead and told him about his interest and that he had read some of Whitehead's works and that he wanted to come and study under him. And Whitehead said, "Send me your grades," and he did. And so Whitehead said, "Come on over." This is the way things were done in those days. You didn't have elaborate application forms. But my father told him, "I don't have much money." And Whitehead said, basically, just make sure you have enough for the crossing and for the first semester, and then we will see at mid-year. And that's exactly what happened. He went over and he did very, very well. And Whitehead called him to his office and told him, Malik, you've done outstandingly well. So from now on, all the rest of your expenses will be covered by us. And that was an incredible break. And one of the things he also had was he won the first prize of the philosophy department at Harvard, which entailed going anywhere for 2 years and studying under any other philosopher. And so he chose Martin Heidegger, another great name in the 20th century, and he went to Germany. Unfortunately, the time was very, very inopportune.
What year was this now?
30s. Yes.
Yeah. And
it was
in Tübingen, was it?
It was in Freiburg.
In Freiburg, oh, yeah.
Freiburg, yes, near the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest.
That's right.
In any case, he enjoyed the courses of Heidegger, but he could only last for 14 months in Germany, not the whole 2 years, because of the oppressive nature of the atmosphere, and he looked Semitic.
The political climate with the Nazis, yeah.
Exactly. So then he returned back to Harvard and completed his dissertation on the metaphysics of time in the philosophies of Whitehead and Heidegger. After Lebanon's independence in 1943, he was sent as the head of the delegation to the conference in San Francisco that founded the United Nations. And he was also sent as Lebanon's ambassador to the United States in Washington. So he was wearing many hats diplomatically at the time. As you mentioned, he became part of the Human Rights Committee under Eleanor Roosevelt. He was first the rapporteur of the committee, and then later he became the president of the committee after Eleanor, which actually put together the preamble and the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the importance, of course, of this declaration, as we all know, is not that it is binding for the states. It has really strong moral importance and persuasion. And in the 20th century, two great events actually benefited from the Universal Declaration, and they were the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the apartheid system in South Africa. And in both cases, the Universal Declaration was held up as the banner, so to speak, under which these movements operated. You mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. Charles Malik was one of the early vocal spearheads in the ideological battle of the Cold War, especially at the United Nations, where he took on Soviet communism, Marxism, Leninism, dialectical materialism, and actually demolished them philosophically in the presence of Soviet delegates. This little country, hardly visible on the map, Lebanon, essentially facing up to the mighty Soviet Union, 11 time zones. In any case, Charles Malik was a vehement opponent of the ideology of communism, and he felt it was such an inhuman ideology will not endure. And he actually passed away a little over a year before the Berlin Wall collapsed.
Is that right?
So, yes. And so, in fact, he predicted the collapse and fall of this system of communism. While he was at the United Nations, he took on many roles, including the president of the Economic and Social Council, and also the president of the General Assembly.
And the Security Council as well.
And the Security Council at one point.
He virtually held all the major, at some stage, all the major positions of the UN.
That's right. So as I said, he wore many hats. Yes. At the UN, and also in Lebanon, he played several political roles as well, and then returned back to academia in the 1960s and taught philosophy. Now, he was a devout Christian.
Now, before you get on to that,
yes,
your generation, which is my generation, we can remember his name, of course, all your life. But I grew up on the other side of the world in New Zealand, and I remember his name being in the headlines and so on. But when I talk to my children today, they've never heard of his name.
Yes.
I'm attempting to reverse that right now. He was such a pivotal figure in a moment of time, in a window of time that was there, that really shaped this 70 plus years of peace, relative peace, the post-war era, that in a sense we could say was shattered February 24th this year, or we could actually say with a forerunner back in 2014 with the invasion of the Crimea, because the Charter of the UN had actually provided a framework where all the nations were responding to the horrific situation of the Second World War, the inhumane treatment of man's fellow human being, that they said, no, we must do something to make this impossible. And so here was this, would you comment on this window of opportunity, a season of grace, we could call it, how it was possible to set up institutions that really have been the framework for the international order these last 7 decades?
Yes, he was having worked in the Human Rights Committee and at the United Nations. He saw firsthand how obstructive the Soviet delegates were being in terms of trying their best not to allow the Universal Declaration to actually see the light of day. And he was very sensitive to the fact that on the horizon there were looming clouds of international tensions coming, namely the beginnings of the Cold War.
Well, and actually, was not this UDHR signed during or just after the Berlin blockade?
The Berlin blockade came in 1949, and this the UDHR was signed and saw the light of day on December 10, 1948. But the thing is, it was thanks largely to Charles Malik, who was the president of the third committee in the fall of 1948, that went through every word and every comma of the declaration to make sure everybody was on board. And even then, during 83 meetings, Jeff, the Soviet delegates were doing everything possible to delay and obstruct and so forth. So he finally, as chairman of that committee, he obtained a stopwatch and he imposed the 3-minute rule. Anyone can speak, any delegate, only for 3 minutes, and then the gavel comes down and it's somebody else's turn. And he did this with Pavlov of the Soviet Union, with everybody. Without this, you wouldn't have been able to reach December 10 when the vote took place. And the night before, on December 9, he gave an interesting speech. He put on his diplomatic hat, where he decided to give every delegation its due in terms of its contributions. And he even said the Soviets, if it were not for the Soviets, we would not have been sensitized to the economic and social rights of people. So, and of course, the next day in the vote, there were no negative votes at all. There were only 8 abstentions, and the rest were all positive.
Which was considered to be quite a miracle. Yeah.
Very much so. And
yeah.
It's that crack in history that you mentioned, through which the UDHR barely passed.
Yes. It seems to me that this was prior to China becoming communist.
Yes.
Prior to the real outbreak of the Cold War.
Yes.
And when in Latin America and Africa, Western missions had still a good influence and a good name, that there was enough goodwill that your father could muster along these principles, but he kept on emphasizing the dignity and the sanctity of every human life. And
Yes.
on the one hand, he was opposing the communist statism, and on the other hand, he was opposing the capitalist individualism. And I understand that he, by bringing in the Latin Americans and the Chinese at the time too, he was bringing in what we would call a majority world influence there.
Yes.
That were much more community oriented. And he said he was stressing this shared relationship of family with community, with nation, and even with God.
Yes.
And that was, he had to resist a certain Anglo-American style individualism that was represented by Eleanor Roosevelt. Is that correct?
To some extent, yes. But you see, he did emphasize the importance of what he called the intermediate institutions in society, what we today talk of as civil society. He called them the intermediate institutions that cushion the individual from the pressures coming down from the state.
We're talking about all the voluntary associations that can be schools,
right, voluntary
clubs,
associations, family, church.
Everything between the state and the family. Yeah.
Precisely, and the individual, rather. Yes, the family is part of those institutions.
Okay.
So yes, and Eleanor Roosevelt, in one of the exchanges, actually came out and sided with him openly against the Soviet assault that wanted pure collectivism at any cost.
Yes.
So he was sensitized to the individual in the, if you like, in the personal existential sense, the Pascalian Kierkegaardian sense, which prefers the living, dying human person facing the challenges of life over abstract ideas and systems, a la Hegel. So yes, he was very much in that, but of course he was against hyper-capitalism, meaning greed, capitalism that is based purely on greed. And in that sense, the greedy individual was not his hero at all.
No, that's where he would have sided with Marx in the sense, yeah. Now, what was behind his understanding of the human being? You started to mention something about his Christian faith. Can you describe what was his affiliation, what was at the core of his understanding of the human being, and how did this relate to his work?
Well, he was a devout Christian, and he often wore his faith on his sleeve, meaning he was not at all ashamed or shy of declaring his faith. And I think his whole story would be very instructive for young Christians aspiring to assume leadership roles in public life, because he demonstrated how a committed Christian can actually function and succeed in the world of politics and in responsibilities in the public square, despite all of the various assaults that come from secularism. So I think his story is extremely instructive in that regard. Also,
now, in some ways, there's a lot of parallels with Robert Schuman, whom we are we're focusing on the Schuman Declaration made on the 9th of May at 6 o'clock. That's why we send out these Schuman Talks each month. There's a whole generation that's known nothing about Schuman either. Your father, I think, was far more prone to speak about his faith and God. Schuman was a very devout believer, but he didn't wear it on his sleeve quite so much, except that they had the same motivation, the same understanding and awareness that our understanding about human beings begins with our understanding about who God is, because either we're created in his image or not. And if not, then that has huge political implications. We're just here by chance. Whereas if
Absolutely.
we are created in the image of God, then every human being needs to be treated with dignity. Now, tell us about his church affiliation, because it sounds to me like he was strongly influenced by what you've said about him. It sounds very much like the Catholic social thinking that shaped Schuman's thinking. To what degree was your father influenced by Catholic social thinking, even though he was not a Catholic himself?
Yes, well, very much so. And I was going to say a word about his ecumenism. I mean, Charles Malik embodied the ecumenical Christian even before the word ecumenical became fashionable. What do I mean? Well, he was Greek Orthodox to the bone. That's how he was born and raised, and he stayed so until the very end. At the same time, he steeped himself in Catholic theology, specifically in Thomism and in Thomas Aquinas, and that's where he got natural law and the importance of natural law, which figures very prominently in the crafting of the Universal Declaration. The preamble of the Declaration, which is actually Charles Malik's text, because there was one by the great jurist René Cassin, which was much longer and which was not as philosophical as they liked. And in the preamble, there's a lot that points to natural law. Also, if you will, in Article 1, let me just read very briefly. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, yeah. Charles Malik wanted to insert endowed by God, by the Creator. But of course, this was resisted at the United Nations. And so it was finally, and I think prudently, left as simply endowed, and everybody can fill in the blanks: endowed by nature, endowed by chance, endowed by the Creator. It depends.
Endowed with reason and conscience.
Yeah. And that's where the Imago Dei comes in, which you mentioned. Yes. That's precisely the Christian underlying view. The other thing is, Charles Malik was a great believer in what he unabashedly called the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Western cumulative tradition. And he felt that that tradition embodied universal values, meaning it imposes a sense of mission on the adherents of that tradition to awaken these universal values across the world and across civilizations and traditions. And his fundamental critique of the West is the West should remain true to the deepest in its own heritage. That's it. His critique had nothing to do with the nihilism of today, where the West is the source of all evil. The West should be guilty of everything, should engage in self-flagellation. Not at all. His point was that the West possesses all that it takes to be the greatest civilization. It just needs to be true and sincere to its deepest.
Yes. Now, I want to read a couple of quotes from your father, where he said, the most important issue in the order of truth today is what constitutes the proper worth and dignity of man. Now, of course, he's using the language that was common in those days, man meaning humanity.
Yes.
And you talk about his ecumenism. Not only was it when sometimes from an evangelical point of view, ecumenism is those mainstream denominations, but he was also a great friend of the evangelical world. Billy Graham invited him to address Wheaton College. Yes. And that's where he gave a very important talk called The Two Tasks. And we'll put a slide up here where he says, if you win the whole world and lose the mind of the world, you will soon discover that you have not won the world. Indeed, it may turn out that you've actually lost the world. Responsible Christians face two tasks, that of saving the soul and that of saving the mind. Can you tell us a little bit more about his understanding from his Christian faith? How did he view the university?
Yes. As I was speaking about his ecumenism, I neglected to add the third dimension, which is that he immersed himself on a daily basis in the Bible. And that endeared him deeply to Protestants and specifically to the evangelical community. And they appreciated him and they invited him, as you said, on many occasions, including in 1980 to Wheaton College, Billy Graham's institution. And that's where he gave that important talk, because he felt that the evangelical community, while extremely sincere when it comes to matters of faith and deeply immersed in the Bible, had the tendency to neglect the intellectual side. And the man being endowed with reason is something very important. Man using reason to be inquisitive and to use its powers for the good is something that is extremely important. And that's where he tried to bring this dual emphasis on both the mind and the spirit to the evangelical community. It was very well received by Carl Henry, by Francis Schaeffer, by many others since then. And so truly his encompassing ecumenism involved Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestants. And yes, in fact, he was very active in the 1960s in the rapprochement between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. After Vatican II, well, even before Vatican II, he had an audience with Pope John the 23rd. And then after Vatican II, on 3 occasions, once in 1964 in Jerusalem, and twice in 1967 in both Istanbul and Rome, he was present at the time when Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I brought about this unprecedented rapprochement between Orthodoxy and Catholicism.
One of his close associates was Jacques Maritain. Would you like to tell us who he was and why that was important?
Yes, Jacques Maritain, of course, is a leading neo-Thomist, namely one of the Catholic thinkers involved in what is known as the Philosophia Perennis, or perennial philosophy, namely updating the Thomistic medieval scholastic synthesis of faith and reason in every generation, to suit or to accommodate some of the new givens of every generation. And certainly Maritain was a personal friend, he and his wife Raissa. Maritain also headed a group of philosophers who were consulted in 1946, just before the work of the the Human Rights Committee under Eleanor. They were consulted to see if there is a general global basis for going ahead with universal human rights. And yeah, Maritain's committee came back with a very interesting report. Yes, we have looked into other cultures and other religious views, and there is a basis for talking universally about human rights. But as Maritain put it, don't ask me about the details and how this will pan out. There is a basis and the rest of the work is going to be yours, he told the committee.
Now, this was not a case of trying to impose a Christian document on everybody. There was a Confucianist, Chang was his name, on
yes,
the committee.
Yes.
And I believe, there were other leading figures around the world from different worldviews who were consulted on this document before it was eventually passed. Is that correct?
Very much so. Chang was the other philosopher on the committee, and he and Charles Malik often were at loggerheads with one another. Charles Malik bringing in the Thomistic natural law tradition, Chang bringing in more the Confucian tradition. But, Chang and Malik became very good friends eventually and worked together in harmony on the declaration. Chang, of course, received a huge blow when in 1949 his home country became communist. and he
Yes.
couldn't return back there, and he had a rather tragic ending in the West. But he certainly brought the dimension of Eastern thought, which was very important for the Universal Project.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, Latin America, the Middle East, also the Saudi Arabian delegation was going to be voting on December 10th. And they had planned to cast a negative vote against the declaration because in Article 18, which was also written by Charles Malik, and its text was accepted as such, he made a point to mention the right to change one's religion. And from a strict Islamic Sharia or Islamic law perspective, that would be apostasy, and apostasy is punishable by death. And so the Saudis were going to vote against the declaration. So Charles Malik and his good friend, the liberal Pakistani Ahmadi delegate, Zafrullah Khan, the two of them went and lobbied the Saudi delegation, essentially telling them, why would you want to take on yourselves the negative vote? Just abstain. If you're unable to vote for the declaration, go for an abstention. And that's actually what happened. So there were no negative votes on December 10 against the UDHR.
I think there were 8 majority Muslim countries that actually voted for, weren't there? And of course, that includes Lebanon itself.
Lebanon was not a Muslim majority country at the time.
Oh, it wasn't? Okay.
No, there were some Muslim countries that voted for, some voted against, but of course, South Africa, the Soviet Union, and Ukraine and Belarus, which had also separate votes. Altogether, there were 8 abstentions.
Now, you mentioned Article 18. Article 16 and Article 18 were 2 articles that, in a sense, reflected a Christian understanding of family in the first place.
Yes.
And then the possibility of changing religion in the second place.
Yes.
Would you comment on those 2 articles, or the other article as well? In the light of this next question, how did your father understand the relationship between human rights and the Christian faith? We're told human rights came out of the Enlightenment, but of course, if we dig deeper, we see that human rights really emerged out of the Middle Ages, the Christian understanding of law. But at the time of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, it was from the anti-church party. Therefore, the Catholic Church took a strong opposition to it. And it was really Jacques Maritain, you mentioned before, your father's friend. He was one of the main influences in helping the Catholic Church recognize this is our story.
Absolutely. And, the thing with the Enlightenment is that they certainly did go against much that came before them, but they were actually, without acknowledging it, standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. And so they had already surreptitiously, or without declaring it, accepted many of the lasting influences that came from the Judeo-Christian tradition earlier. That's an important point. You mentioned 2 articles, 16 and 18. It so happens that both of them were written by Charles Malik. It is Malik's text for the family article of Article 16, and his text for the freedom of conscience article in 18. And also the preamble, which is the most philosophical of all, was his contribution. Now, all of these have, as you mentioned, Christian undertones very clearly. And there is the emphasis on the human person in the tradition of personalism. Mounier, of course, being...
What is personalism?
Well, it means the most important focus that should take place it would be the human person, rather than abstract ideas, rather than systems, rather than factors and elements and so forth, and processes.
And
that is
rather
the
than the
point.
economy or the state, but the person. Yes.
Exactly. I mean, all of the things that Marx placed uppermost should actually be secondary, and the human person should come first. The state is there to serve the person and not the other way around. And so all of these notions, of course, exist in Christian theology and Christian understanding. In the Catholic notion of subsidiarity, which also both Maritain and Charles Malik adopted. And so natural law, subsidiarity, the importance of the human person, all of these things were what informed, the Christian animus, if you will.
So is it correct to say that personalism really it was a strong, philosophy of life that was at the heart of the Catholic social thinking?
Very much so.
John Paul II would have been a personalist.
Absolutely.
And yeah. Okay.
And it goes back to the great encyclical from the late 19th century of Pope Leo XIII, Aeterni Patris, and then also another encyclical by him, Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum laid the foundation, if you will, for Catholic subsidiarity thinking, and Aeterni Patris revived the Thomistic synthesis of faith and reason. Both of these became potent Catholic theological and philosophical points that Malik relied upon.
Yes, and they strongly influenced Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi, three of the key people in the establishment of the European coal and steel community. Yeah,
precisely. It's an amazing historical moment. Yes.
So on both sides, of the Atlantic, these developments were taking place. The UN to begin with, the UDHR, and then of course the Council of Europe, and eventually the European coal and steel community, all of which were part of a bigger nest of issues, beginning of NATO, Marshall Plan, etc., all of which the World Bank helped to shape a new world order following the disaster of World War II. Now back to Article 16. Tell us about that. What is that? That's on the family, correct?
Yes, and the family is regarded as the essential unit in those intermediate institutions that Charles Malik emphasized as being very important to protect the individual from oppression coming down from the state. And so the family, which unfortunately in today's world is under tremendous assault in the culture war that is raging in the West. I mean, if Charles Malik came back today, he would not take very kindly to what we generally call the woke. And that's where the family is under assault. At the time, of course, in his day, communism was the main, if you will, foe or enemy of the family. So that makes Charles Malik's thinking and writing extremely relevant for today's world, because we still have totalitarianisms with us. We have communism still in China, we have theocratic totalitarianisms, and we have the culture war being waged by the left in the West. And all of these are anti-family. So Article 16 is absolutely crucial.
Yes, we take for granted this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, just a few years ago, it was the 70th anniversary. In 2 years' time, I think it's going to be the 75th anniversary and needing more attention again. But probably, I think it's fair to say, and I think a lot of historical observers at the time would have said, without your father's diplomacy, theology, and philosophy, and personal skills, it would never have happened. There were many steps along the way that had to go through various committees as well. And there were such hard-necked pragmatists, and yet your father kept on hammering back on this aspect of the human being needs to be at the center, because that was what was the great travesty of the Second World War. And
yes, much of this story is captured in a fine book by the Harvard law professor Marianne Glendon. The book is entitled A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration. And there's a lot about Charles Malik in there. And Professor Glendon was a pioneer in bringing out for today's audiences and today's readers the role that you just mentioned that Charles Malik played, which was a very unique and special role.
Well, you also published with your Charles Malik Foundation, The Challenge of Human Rights.
Yes.
And that's a book that's available as well. That tells much of the story. Is that correct?
Yes, it also includes many of his interventions during the Human Rights Commission discussions, many of his speeches before, during, and after. It kind of chronicles his contribution to the whole human rights project through his own writings. And that's only his writings in English. We have another volume in Arabic that is not a translation of this, but actually other writings on human rights in Arabic that are yet to be translated into English by Charles Malik. Yes.
Now, Habib, this raises the issue of where are we at today with human rights, because it was very clear in your father's understanding that the human rights did not come from a government. They did not come from the UN. They were recognized as having come from the giver of life. Today, and of course, you know, the Enlightenment tried to, and secular humanism actually tries to hijack, as it were, human rights. And now we have all sorts of things being called human rights that are just being decided by this committee or that committee, this government or that government. Do we have any foundations for human rights in the world today, in the international community? It's really the weight of the historical momentum of the UDHR that still gives it legitimacy. But there are a lot of people who are trying to undermine the philosophical basis of it.
Very much so. And actually the Universal Declaration remains, I think, as a very important and unique international benchmark to bring us back, if you like, to the sound default of what human rights are. Because since the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, we've had an explosion of a cottage industry of so-called human rights. And many of them have been pseudo rights, frankly. They have very little to do with the human person and everything to do with different political agendas and different esoteric, I can say, agendas of groups and you know, non-authentic minorities. And you know, the sky is the limit to how much you can distort human rights by following that path. So the Universal Declaration remains as the sound default to which we can all return in the face of many of these pseudo rights, I would say.
Yes. There are some who suggested the need for a Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities, and I think your father saw rights and responsibilities very much going hand in hand.
Very much so. Also, there was a move right after the Universal Declaration to try and make these things binding on the states. And so they went for about 19 years trying to hammer out the covenants, which would, and they finally appeared in 1966. But the problem with the covenants on human rights is that they all had escape clauses inserted in them so that states would be able to sign them and have a way out, as it were. So my father initially was excited about the covenants, but a couple of years after the UDHR, he saw the futility of this and actually abandoned that particular path. So the moral power of a declaration rather than a covenant that is binding turned out historically to be far more potent than anything that would bind a state.
Yes. Now, coming back to Berlin and the Berlin Wall, we're celebrating the anniversary of the collapse of the opening of the Berlin Wall this day. Of course, the work of the Helsinki Committee was a very important stepping stone towards that milestone event, which drew on the UDHR, drew on the concept of human rights. The Soviet Union was forced to actually agree with this Helsinki Committee. People like Václav Havel were hammering Helsinki. So could the fall of the Berlin Wall have happened without the UDHR?
Well, who knows about the ifs of history? I'm a historian, but we can speculate. But as I tried to mention earlier, one of the great landmarks in which the Universal Declaration played an important role, morally speaking, and not legally in terms of binding, was the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Many of the groups, including Havel's, I think, Civic Forum, and there was Charter 77 and many others, they all relied on the Universal Declaration in one way or another as their banner. And once it was enshrined in Helsinki, I mean, that gave a tremendous boost to what eventually began to unravel in Eastern Europe with the wall and then the whole domino effect afterwards. So, yeah, I suppose one can say that without the UDHR, things would have been very different. I don't know I think communism would have collapsed anyway, because there were other factors at play here. I mean, the United States and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s were literally driving the Soviet economy into the ground with their, competitive escalation of technology and armament.
There was the economic, there was the military.
Exactly. All of these things would have, but I think the Universal Declaration brought in the moral dimension. And a figure like John Paul II also played an absolutely crucial role there.
Well, with solidarity in Lech Wałęsa, and actually there was a kind of a spiritual uprising in all sorts of different ways, the pan-European picnic, the human chain, in the Baltics, etc., etc. But there was a statement of what is a human right, that was established by the UDHR, that was a great encouragement to those who were suffering under the communist oppression.
Precisely. I mean, we have 30 very clearly crafted and carefully written articles, and we have a preamble that lays down the philosophical origins and basis for these 30 articles. And implied in all of this are the obligations and the responsibilities that you mentioned. So you have a full array of moral power that is in support of fundamental human rights. And this is important in the face of oppressors, as it is important also in the face of obfuscators, like we see today, the whole business of pseudo rights. That's kind of a new attack through obfuscation rather than through oppression.
Yes. Now, you've mentioned your father having to really address the Soviet delegation, and Mr. Gromyko was the main Soviet representative. You mentioned Pavlov, and your father actually was the one who was standing in the breach philosophically against the power really of the communist world. Let's just watch a short clip that shows the delegates arriving in 1948 in the New York headquarters of the of the UN. We see firstly Robert Schuman. There's no soundtrack to this. Robert Schuman arrives. Then Henry Spark from Belgium arrived. Robert Schuman was the French foreign minister at the time and had been very much involved with also the formation of the Council of Europe. He was yet to be involved in the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community. Then after Henry Spark, your father arrives. And then shortly after that, we see the Soviet delegation, Mr. Gromyko, who's also called Mr. Niet, or constantly vetoing everything. And so this is what we can see on our screens right now.
Yes, absolutely. The sparring that took place in committee between Charles Malik and some of the Soviet delegates was quite noteworthy, especially when you look at the verbatim records of the discussions in committee. But also in the early 1950s, the head of the Soviet delegation at the time was a man named Vyshinsky, who had been actually the prosecutor general under Stalin back in the late 1930s during the infamous purges. And Vyshinsky would stand there in front of the show trials where poor hapless people would be brought in to make public confessions about sins they had never committed. And then if Vyshinsky's finger went to the right, the person would go to Siberia, never to be heard from again. And if it went to the left, he would be executed. That same person was the head of the Soviet delegation in the early 1950s. And Charles Malik had many sparring matches with him during the speeches of the United Nations. You know, at the time, the United Nations speeches were televised on the black and white television box, and a lot of people saw them in their homes. And well, I have a small anecdote I can relate if you're interested. Vyshinsky once gave a speech in which he quoted an unnamed German poet who makes fun of philosophers dabbling in politics. And Vyshinsky didn't name the poet, and he didn't name whom he meant among the delegates, but he obviously meant Charles Malik, and the whole house roared with laughter and so on. Well, Charles Malik was sick the following day, and he just put aside his notes and he started raking his brain. I have heard this poem before. And he worked hard that night with one of his assistants to bring out books from the library. Finally, close to midnight, he discovered it was Heinrich Heine, the great German poet.
Yes.
Much to Malik's surprise and delight, he discovered another poem by Heinrich Heine, which actually is more damning about lawyers dabbling in politics. And Vyshinsky, of course, was a lawyer by training. And so the next day, Charles Malik goes in and says, the honorable delegate from the Soviet Union yesterday quoted an unnamed German poet about philosophers in politics. Well, that poet is Heinrich Heine. And if you'll allow me, I would like to quote another poem from the same poet from Heine about lawyers in politics. And he read that, and the house was brought down, and Vyshinsky basically sat red-faced like this.
Yeah.
Another one of those interesting stories from the 1950s at the UN.
Well, your father was up against these die-hard communists. My question is, what might he want to say to President Putin today, who justifies what he's doing in the name of Russian Orthodoxy?
Yes, well, I think Charles Malik would be deeply saddened by the ongoing war right now. Not only that, but he would be very sorry for the deaths on both sides, young Russian soldiers as well as Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. And also, I think he would realize that imperial quests through violence and conquest are never happy enterprises, and that the world really ought to move on beyond them. I think these would be his attitude. You know, the important thing about Charles Malik is that he was very careful during his attacks on Soviet communism, on Marxism-Leninism, on dialectical materialism. He was very careful to state right after the attack, on many occasions, that this is one thing, and the great Russian people, the suffering Russian people, is something else completely. In fact, the Russian people have been victims of this particular ideology, as far as Charles Malik is concerned. Mm-hmm. And he loved the Russian people, he loved Russian culture, he certainly loved Russian orthodoxy, with which he deeply identified, and he was quite knowledgeable and versed in Russian 19th century literature. Of course, in translation, he didn't read Russian, specifically Dostoevsky. And I got a lot of influence from my father when it came to Dostoevsky. So the Christian side of Russian culture was something he felt that would eventually save Russia. And in a sense, that's exactly what happened. So it's almost like what one of Dostoevsky's characters in the book The Possessed, Shatov, what he said, that Christ will come again as a Russian peasant. Well, in a sense, metaphorically, the Russian Orthodox Church, after so much suppression, came back, and Christ is back in Russia openly. I think this is an important point that Charles Malik emphasized. Of course, he would also lament the fact that Russia has, because of this war and because of other things that have happened in recent years, been cut off from the West, and in a sense been cast into the lap of China, which is not the place for Russia. And so I think, if anything, Charles Malik would tell Vladimir Putin, end this war, make it up to your Ukrainian brothers, and extend, re-embrace Russia. The West should re-embrace post-communist Russia, and because at the end of the day, the Russian heritage and the Western heritage sit on the same set of universal values: Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian. No question about it. This whole idea of Russia being a world apart is a form of Eurasian secular nationalism that really is a distortion of the basics. The basics are that Russia is part of the broader civilizational West and does not belong with China, does not belong with Iran, does not belong with these. So this is what Malik would be saying today if he were around.
Dr. Malik, I want to thank you so much for sharing this wonderful story. It's a story that needs to be told much more, and fresh generations who are being robbed of the richness of actually a historical background need to know about the people who have shaped the freedoms that we have so often taken for granted. And I've very much enjoyed hearing you tonight. Thank you very much indeed. And
thank you very much. Let me just say we are doing our best at the Philos Project to bring out the legacy of Charles Malik and many of the things that we have discussed tonight, and that you feel the new generation needs to know about him. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Schuman Center.